Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's so great to see so many bright faces this morning. I'm just going to go right into it. ECOWAS is 50, such an intimidating age. All over the world, 50 is a watershed moment. It's a time for reflection. It's a time to unpack, to ask yourselves the difficult questions. How have you fared over the last 50 years? ECOWAS was formed in 1975. 16 African countries came to Lagos to form the economic community of West African states. And at that time, 6 or 7 of these countries had just undergone a coup, so it was a child of necessity. At that time, ECOWAS was meant to aid trade within the region and regional cooperation, both, within states and then between the region and other parts of the globe. After about 2-3 years, the group said, just evaluating, and they said, you cannot really separate trade and economic sovereignty from democratic stability. And so the mandate of ECOWAS was expanded to include security, democracy, borderless West Africa, and so many other things, so many other beautiful things. And this morning, we are going to be doing some sort of stress tests on ECOWAS. How has ECOWAS fared? I'm going to be joined by some of the best and brightest from across the region. I will just be introducing them. So please help me as I welcome Ms. Mina Mensah, who is the Director, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, Africa Office. Please welcome her until she gets to the stage. Beautiful, beautiful woman. Okay, so sorry. Hello. Okay. Next, we have Matthew Aibakuro. I hope I'm not murdering your name, who is the Governance Advisor, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. Welcome, Matthew. Please keep clapping until he gets here. We don't play on this panel. We have Dr. Chukwuemeka B. Eze, who is joining us online today. He is the Director, Democratic Resilience Open Society Foundations. Is he online yet? And joining us, lastly, we have Mr. Stanley Achono, who is the Senior Advisor, Thought and Maize Advisory. Thank you so much. Thank you. We're so far away. Can I sit here? Yes. Okay, they should. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Maybe you could move this way. Is Dr. Chukwuemeka online, please? Can we see him? Dr. Chukwuemeka B. Eze. So, Mr. Stanley, I think we're just going to start from you. What has worked, ECOWAS, over the last 50 years? Yeah.
Okay. Over the last 50 years, our passport works. The free movement, at least on paper, until you get to the border, at least the visa-free process works. Trade has kind of improved alongside, even though there are a couple of bottlenecks, when you get to crossing the border. Regional cooperation at very high level politically has also worked, until, the past 2 years. There has been, significant progress in restoring democracy peace building. We grew up knowing ECOMOG, restoring peace in Liberia, and the rest of them. At very high level, in some instances, it has worked. What has not worked is the economic component of the ECOWAS. We haven't successfully traded with each other as much as we should. While our passport has allowed us free travel, our movement has still been restricted. And I think that, every progress you measure, there are those bits of bottlenecks and bureaucracy that has prevented, the full-scale achievement of what was set out in the specific protocols.
Thank you. Ms. Mina, I'm going to come to you just now. In 2020, I think ECOWAS faced its greatest challenge so far when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger separated from the bloc. And there has been a romanticization of military coups in the region, and that's because when these three countries were leaving the bloc, they made sure to make it known that they were leaving because they felt that ECOWAS was susceptible to global or Western influences. So this ECOWAS at 50, what do you think about ECOWAS's commitment to democracy and openness in the region?
And thank you very much. It's quite an interesting question. If you look at the 50 years of ECOWAS, just like you said, it has moved from being an economic bloc to a player in the human rights and the protection of democratic governance. And it has achieved some strides, great strides. When you look at the protocols, for instance, one of the protocols ensures that there are free elections, the media is protected, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And then there's also the fact that when it comes to things like what you talked about, the Mali and Niger situation, they act very quickly. Unfortunately, some of the actions are not even across board because ECOWAS seems to be very quick at protecting democracy when there's a coup d'etat. But when you look at things that are happening in countries where there are democratic governments in place, but the human rights of the people are being abused, you realize that ECOWAS tend to turn a blind eye on some of these things. And then another key issue is the fact that sanctions are normally targeted at things that are economic and will affect the general population, but they don't necessarily affect the individuals. So at the end of the day, you have placed in sanctions. People are suffering, and it's the citizenry that it affects the most. And so when the citizenry, they look at this, they go like, these people are just behaving like the West. Economic sanctions. What about the fact that people committed offenses and you are fighting for them? For example, when ECOWAS insists on ensuring that democratically elected governments are removed, yes, it is true. They were voted in power democratically. But then, when they were practicing things that does not inure to our benefit as countries, where was ECOWAS? Where was ECOWAS? But you are insisting that a military junta overthrew a government. You are insisting and backing that they should come back. Nobody wants military juntas, but at the end of the day, when things are happening in a democracy and they are not going the way they ought to go, ECOWAS must be able to ensure that such things are looked at and worked on so that it doesn't become like the normal Western thing, sanctions. Whether the sanctions apply to the citizens in a negative manner or in a positive manner, we do not know. And I think that's one of the things that ECOWAS ought to look at. In 50 years, what kind of evaluation have they done in terms of some of the functions that they have put in place? How does it affect the people? So that going forward the next 50 years, when ECOWAS is putting out sanctions or planning, they can say that, okay, the last 50 years, we did A, B, and C. This is the results that we had. The next 50 years, we are channeling our efforts to ensure that citizens are at the forefront of the things that we do, and not governments as, the political class, but citizens are at the center of what we do. One of the things that I'll commend ECOWAS for is for the courts. The fact that citizens are able to engage the courts directly. And that is something that I think is a good thing. We need to strengthen and ensure that we have that. So for me, it is true. Citizens think that ECOWAS is really a Western structured thing, influenced thing, because of some of the actions that have been taken. It does not mean that we cannot work on those actions to ensure that we pick what is good from the best and apply to our local or our West African situations and improve on them and make it benefits for the society.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'm going to come back to you about the point about how we as Africans perceive the bloc. But your last point leads me very nicely to my next question to Matthew. How do member states of ECOWAS balance national interests and regional priorities? Because we've seen incidences. In fact, a lot of the times, all of the problems within the economic bloc, it is because national interests do not really align with regional ones. So how do we balance those two, especially that the two are equally as important?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the first thing to say when you reflect on ECOWAS after 50 years is ECOWAS needs to be certain if it wants to be an integrated region or not. There seems to be a certain degree of, I don't want to call it unseriousness, but it doesn't seem like we mean business about integrating. If you integrated since the 1970s, and like my colleague said, even today we still have experiences at borders. We have to be certain if we want to be sovereign countries operating on our own, or if we want to work as a region. Stanley mentioned issues like trade, for instance. So ECOWAS integrated since the 1970s. Today, depending on which year statistic you're looking at, intra-regional trade in ECOWAS is between 5 to 10%. We don't even compare to the African average, which is around 15 to 18%. If you go to regions like, let's say, the EU, we're looking at 60-something%. Even if you go to North American free trade area, we're looking at 50 to 60%. And at ECOWAS, we can't even get to 15%. If ECOWAS needs to be a point of integration, both on the economy, on democracy, and otherwise, we actually need to mean business. The second point you need to know, well, worth noting, is that there is two levels of allegiance to ECOWAS. There's allegiance of the governments that form the body, and then there's the allegiance of the citizens. And the citizens will be the instrument through which they will hold their governments accountable for how ECOWAS is integrated to serve the purpose of the region. Then ECOWAS needs to make sense to the citizens. I recently had a trip to Ghana, which is obviously an ECOWAS country. The experience I had at the border in Ghana, I mean, I don't want to talk about it, but it's a bit embarrassing that I wouldn't even have that kind of experience going to a European country or even another Western country. So the point is that you need to ensure that ECOWAS is serious about actually being integrated, number one. Secondly, ECOWAS needs to be able to connect to the citizens within the region. You talk about democracy at the national level because these are sovereign countries. But where democracy is failing most across the region is actually at the subnational and local levels. Citizens do not really understand or experience the benefits of a democratic system. And so when ECOWAS speaks, it's almost as if they are just talking for the sake of speaking and not actually connecting to how citizens experience democracy and development on an ongoing basis in their day-to-day lives. The third point I need to make, which I think Stanley started off on, is ECOWAS is supposed to be an economic community. The economy was a foundational reason. It was really great that they expanded the mandate over a few years to cover other issues. But in the last couple of decades, it's like the focus has been more on these other issues, political stuff, democratic stuff, which are really important, but you need to strike a balance between how the regional integration is benefiting citizens and government as well as democratic issues. And I think that we're not doing that as well as we should from the data you see around economic growth in the region, intra-trade within the region. You remove tariffs within the ECOWAS region, but non-tariff barriers are even more problematic than the tariffs themselves. And so for you to get that balance between the allegiance people have to ECOWAS and their national priorities, ECOWAS needs to justify or rationalize its usefulness to the citizens of those countries. Otherwise, a lot of the conversation is happening at the top and citizens are not connected to the objectives of ECOWAS.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to make a point that both of you have, highlighted, which is that for ECOWAS to be really effective in protecting democracy, it has to go beyond the ballot box. Because a lot of times when ECOWAS steps in, is either when democracy has completely failed or when the people are disillusioned with democracy and have turned military. That is then when ECOWAS step in. We saw it in Gambia, we saw it in Niger, and all of these other countries. It is only at the point of failure that ECOWAS steps in, not before we get to that point. And it reflects in how ECOWAS responds to election violence. Threat to election doesn't start on the day of the election. It starts from the democratic process. And ECOWAS has to commit to protecting the entirety of the democratic process rather than protecting just the election day or whoever the winner is and maintaining peace on that day. The violence starts before, and if we don't nip it in the bud, it then leads to the complete collapse of democracy, where you then find ECOWAS scrambling to save.
Okay, that's interesting. Checking again if Dr. Chukwuemeka is online. Can we see him? He's not online yet. Okay, thank you. We can just... very interesting. Matthew seems to think that trade and economy should be at the forefront of ECOWAS engagements, and Stanley seems to think that democracy and political stability should be at the forefront. And it's interesting, Mina, so be the tie breaker for us. How do we balance these two?
And that's an interesting combination from the both of them, because I see this trend that is happening all over the world, where people think that money is everything. Economic empowerment is very good, but you need a certain kind of environment for your economy to grow. Of course, ECOWAS started as an economic bloc, so their focus shouldn't shift. And I don't think the focus has really shifted. I think that it is easier for them to concentrate on the political aspect because there's been so much happening around. So I think that we need to find a balance. If a country is developing economically, and I haven't seen on this continent a country that is hasn't got the proper structures in place that is actually achieving a lot of economic strides.
Exactly.
If the people are poor, democracy will not work. They are not interested in elections. They are not interested in putting people to come and govern them when the bread and butter issues are being talked about. But then if there are bread and butter issues and people are not free to express themselves, people are not free to move around, people are not free to contribute to development, it becomes a problem. So ECOWAS need to sit down and find a balance. How they do it, I will not be able to tell them from the top of my head. But I think as a continent, as a regional body, ECOWAS needs to sit down and identify its priorities very well and put in place channels that can work. Civil society plays a very strong role in ensuring that democracy and economic governance work well. And I think that those partnerships and those links should be built so that we don't tilt towards one side alone, but we balance both. So I think that there's a very thin line between those two key areas. Okay. And we need to find a way around those.
Very interesting. Back to you, Stanley, and just to emphasize what you said, that without democratic stability, the economy cannot work, right? And related to that, I read a report, I think it was from Afrobarometer, that only 56% of Africans know about, of West Africans know about ECOWAS. I was a bit surprised because 56% is quite small for a regional body that remains the only comprehensive regional cooperation framework as far as West Africa is concerned. And even 56%, it was only that way because they covered Nigeria and Ghana, you know. So what do you think about the complete absence of ECOWAS in countries where, number one, the civic space is not as open, number two, the economic growth is not as much as other countries, and three, in particular, Francophone countries? What do you think about that?
I think this ties back to the very conversations we've had. I think that I'll be surprised if most of those who responded to being aware of ECOWAS, all of them probably have national passports with ECOWAS written on it. That's probably the most connections they have, because exactly. When you have any of the regional, any of the countries that are member states always have ECOWAS written on it. So I would be surprised if most of the respondents who said they are aware of ECOWAS come from that perspective. I think that the biggest other time that ECOWAS became an important entity on the continent was probably in peacekeeping missions in the war-torn regions, Liberia and the rest of them, right? And that is where the conversation between governance and economic connection comes into play. The biggest other threat outside of the security that I can remember that has had direct impact between two member countries will be when Nigeria closed its land borders, and trading between Nigeria and Benin Republic and Niger and Chad sort of stopped, right? And people within that region would have felt the impact of that closure and would have recognized the role that the economic bloc plays in the small trade that we see and the restrictions that followed movement across the border. I think the biggest challenge for me in terms of level of awareness with the public is that the work that the regional body has played has become extremely high level. It's always at ministerial level, it's always at head of state level. It has not translated to brick and mortar on the ground. For instance, there is a regional plan to build a highway across the region, starting from Nigeria all the way, transversing all the way to Ghana and the rest of the countries. There is the West African gas pipeline, yes. Right? Mm-hmm. Until we are delivering directly on things that impact economic well-being of the people, popularity of ECOWAS will not be felt. Unlike other regional blocs, and there are examples. Let's look at the EU, for example, and Matthew did reference the European Union. If you have traveled through the European Union, the only border you encounter is at the point of entering the Schengen region. Mm-hmm. Once you are within the Schengen region, you move from one country to the other, you won't notice the border. If you have done road trip in Europe and you have moved from one Schengen country to the other, you won't know when you cross from one country to the other. No sign of any border, right? And that is a direct signal that even if you carry goods from one country to the other, you won't even know when you cross the border, right? For us to make trade work, that would then directly put ECOWAS at the center of people's well-being, we need to completely liberate our movement. Not just because I have passport and I arrive at an international airport, but when I cross semi-border, I don't know when I move from Nigeria to the semi-side of the Benin Republic. Then I can start to feel the impact. If my supplier is in Cotonou and I'm in Abuja and the goods can arrive the way I will send something from here to Owerri, then I will start to feel the impact. And I can be a tailor in Abuja and my client is in Ghana, and I can say, God is good, take this to Accra, and it will go without any challenge. Until we get to that nitty-gritty level of implementation, we will continue to have high-level communique at head of state summit level or ministerial level that does not mean anything to average person on the continent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So it seems Matthew has convinced you.
The democratic part is still very important.
So, Matthew, back to you. Development partners, have supported the democratic leg of ECOWAS's work. But I hear it from all three of you that a lot still needs to be done. So what needs to change in how we relate with the bloc? And I mean, we as in activists, CSOs, donors, the entire civil society ecosystem, what needs to change in how we relate with the bloc in such a way that democracy is still a mode of governance in the next 20 years in the region?
I think I should start by saying, for plausible deniability, that we are not against democracy, right? We understand the importance of it. I just think events in the last few years has created a long overdue reflection on the utilitarian value of democracy. I'm not just taking it for granted. And I do think we need to have those conversations. I was going to reel out some statistics, but I should say that it doesn't take an academic or an amazingly intelligent person to look at all these indices on democracy and human rights and all of it and find that the people at the top of the indices are the richest countries. And there is a mutually reinforcing relationship between economic growth and democratic ideals and norms and how they operate, and more importantly, the resilience of democracy in countries. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner in the 90s, did conceptualize development as freedom. And if people don't have freedom economically, socially, politically, then you cannot talk about their development. Sure. And I think there's been an emphasis on a certain part of the freedom, the political freedom, without looking at the economic freedom that underpins how people exercise those political rights. In terms of what development partners should do, look, I can say a lot of things at the top of my mind about what we should be focusing on. But development partners in any proper development partnership setting will work best when an agenda is very clear. If a civil society member or somebody from the EU or the UK or the US or some development partnership group comes to ECOWAS and it's very clear that this is what ECOWAS wants to achieve, then they can really get on board with it and have that bit of partnership to get it done. And I just don't think there is that degree of clarity, except people who engage on a daily basis with ECOWAS or have some bit of technical knowledge. The average civil society person doesn't know how to hook onto the agenda of ECOWAS for the objective of the country they are in or for the region as a whole. And in terms of what should be that agenda, which I guess is a bit of a future look on this, there are just 4 quick things I want to say. The first one is, Stanley alluded to it at the beginning, I think ECOWAS is very reactive and not proactive, right? And that is a bit problematic for a regional body that's supposed to be dragging along all these countries to development. There is a point at which we have to stop worrying too much about whether ECOWAS sanctions are working or not working. ECOWAS is not a headmaster in a primary school. The sanctions shouldn't be the focus of ECOWAS. It should be how you enable these countries to develop better. Stanley mentioned roads. What sort of roads, what sort of energy resources? If you were to move from here to Ghana, you will need to buy a different SIM card because the one you have in Nigeria does not work. What sort of digital inclusion measures are you putting together to ensure that these countries work better? Not just you holding the whip and saying election has finished, this election did not work, where are the sanctions coming from? You should be looking at enabling more than just sanctions. The second point are the young people. Just over 60% of people in ECOWAS are under 25 years old. If you look at that and you don't see a clear-cut strategy in how ECOWAS is focusing on how you liberate these young people, how do you enable them to actually drive this? I mean, at my age, I'm feeling a bit old saying this, but our time is passing, and there are young people who are a lot more resourceful, who have a different idea of how the world works. And when I was younger, I still had CD plates and all of it. This generation has stuff that we couldn't even imagine when we were kids. As a region, what is your strategy to get these young people to move forward. The third point is just how you strengthen oversight. When I was doing research, I kept coming across these ECOWAS Court of Justice judgments that are really amazing. There is one on Nigeria that actually affirmed the right to education in Nigeria. What has the Nigerian government done with it? Are you going to just tick the box that you have an ECOWAS Court of Justice? How are you going to start implementing the decisions of the ECOWAS Court of Justice? And if Nigeria, as the biggest player in the region, is not listening to the judgments of the ECOWAS Court, then who is going to listen to it? And just finally, just to wrap up, I do think, as much as possible, that if we do not get this mutually reinforcing relationship between economic growth and democracy to work, and at any point in time we are reactively going after one or the other, we just won't see sustainable development within the sub-region.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. Dr. Eze is now on. Please welcome Dr. Eze. He's the Director of Democratic Resilience Open Society Foundations. He's joining us online. Media, please. While we wait for him to come on, Mina, I'm going to ask a controversial question. I hope we don't fight.
Go ahead and ask.
So there is an anti-West sentiment across the region, especially in Francophone countries. The global North countries are under fire by African states for an outsized influence on its economic outlook, political outlook, social outlook, basically the everyday life of everybody in West Africa. To a great extent, it's believed to be influenced by the global North countries. And we have seen this sentiment being underpinning the military coups that have happened across the region. Do you think that these accusations have merit? That's number one question. Number two question is, we are seeing West Africa is now like the new bride. We've seen Russia, we've seen China, we've seen a number of other countries also, try to cash in. And I'm putting that in quotes because I don't know how better to say it. Do you think there is some merit? And if there is, don't you think that there needs to be, is it not the same logic of extraction that is underpinning the relationship with the old guard, with the new guards that are coming in?
Wow, loaded. Well, from what I see, when the gains of democracy are not being realized, and that is what is happening in West Africa, not in West, on the continent. The gains of democracy are not actually being realized. And people are pushing back. You were talking about Francophone countries. Obviously, for us in the Anglophones, ours was more of an association. Theirs was assimilation. Yeah. So they felt it, or they are feeling it, more than we seem to be having. But you see, we are in a global world, and the influence of the West is all over the place. Unfortunately, with the other players coming in, my thinking is that Africans should think for themselves. Africans should think for themselves. We ought to be selfish, because whoever is coming to help us wants something from us. It is to their benefit, and not necessarily. Of course, we'll give you something small, but we'll take a lot more than what we are bringing in. So it is time that we sit down, Africa. What do we want as Africans, as West Africans? What exactly? My brother here said that ECOWAS should be clear on what do we want, because the influences are so many. The West is coming, the Chinese are coming, the Asians are coming, whoever is coming. Let's sit down. What are they bringing in? Some form of development, but what are they taking out? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. What are they taking out? And what are we doing for ourselves? We seem to have this dependency syndrome that everything that we are doing, somebody should come and help us. And because of that, we have challenges, because we think that somebody should come and help us. This conversation, you know, I'm going to divert a bit to the conversation of reparation. What we have, what are we doing with it? Of course, they might owe us something, but are they going to give it? So once we talk about reparation, let's look at our various countries. What we have, what they left us, what have we as Africans done with what we have? And until we rise up as Africans and decide that we are Africans, nobody is going to develop this continent for us. Trust you me, nobody will develop this continent for us. So until our leaders become less selfish and more selfless, and until we, the people, we demand accountability and exercise accountability. I'm sorry, people will come in from the north, west, south. They will bring us something, but they will take a lot more than what we are willing to give.
Absolutely.
That's my take on it.
Absolutely.
Essentially abandoning one oppressor for another
For
oppressor.
another, yes.
Essentially, that's what we are doing.
Thank you so much, and thanks for being very diplomatic with that answer. If I was asked that question, Uncle Tapsi would have been picked from here.
In fact, I was going to start by being myself. Blunt. And I'm like, no, you can't do that.
Thank you. Fantastic. Stanley, to you, if you're standing up, I cannot see you from here. I just want to say. One question to you, Stanley. There are new forms of authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. I keep saying that African, and I'm so sorry if anybody is offended by this, but African governments keep looking for new ways to oppress. One of the ways is we have seen the continuous evolvement or repurposing of content moderation laws to as instruments of oppression for the press. And, you know, it looks like we are actively just looking for ways to suppress dissent and all that. Now, this also means that ECOWAS needs to evolve its responses to these new threats. There are also issues of mismanagement of public services. Mm-hmm. We've seen the increase in privatization of essential services. We've seen Senegal has privatized their water. Nigeria has privatized power. It's about to privatize water. And the excuse with this pro-privatization lobbyist or apologist is that African governments have not been able to manage public services well. So how does ECOWAS reimagine its protocols in response to these new emerging threats of authoritarianism, threats to standard of life and quality of living?
Okay, first of all, I think that our leaders in the region, they have weaponized poverty, essentially turned it into a weapon of oppression, and that is where they start from. You know, people are not economically empowered to make independent decisions. That's why it's easy to buy elections in the region, because I'm thinking about my survival today rather than the greater good of everyone. So we have weaponized poverty. I also think that as a people in the region, we all suffer from PTSD of military violence that we have experienced in one form or the other. And I say this in the sense that I don't think as a people we are capable of recognizing our freedom when it is being violated. I think that people are able to connect to these violations when they suffer it personally. They are not able to empathize with each other. We also as a people associate leadership with strongman behavior. So when you are very democratic, our people call you weak. They don't call you a good leader. They think you are a weak leader. So we are in some sort of way receiving what we expect from our leaders, that we expect violence to be unleashed on us when we demand for better. We expect to be bought out, our public interest to be paid for and bought out, and which is why people are unable to connect this, and I'm not against privatization, but there are essential services that government must provide. If you're handing off one service in order to focus on another service, that's an understandable approach. But where you hand off something like public water supply, and then you also hand off health provision, then you are failing the people, right? If there is method to the madness, in quotes, it would be bearable to say, okay, there is an advantage in giving up control of this for better service delivery of this. But I think that generally, as a people, we are not even capable of understanding how terrible the oppression that we face. Nigeria passed the cybersecurity law. The conversation around this law did not take into account how that would directly affect the ability of the media to hold government accountable. At the point of discussion of this bill, everybody focused on what an angry Stanley in my 2x4 bed, sweating and tweeting. That was more important than the greater good of the ability of journalists at Premium Times and CJID are able to deliver in holding government accountable, right? So at that moment, I was more focused on dealing with Stanley in his one-bedroom corner versus the greater good of the general public and the ability of the fourth estate of the realm to freely do their job, right? So our people are not always able to make those connections about how these little oppressions in the way that it affects only Stanley versus in the way it affects the greater good and the ability of the media to do the work. So we need better education, yes, which can be delivered by the government, which is not delivering, which is also part of their effort to weaponize poverty in order to hold us down. So we're in trouble.
Thank you. Ifeanyi, I want to remind you that your future as an African is dependent on what we say on this panel. So please, we are going to take one question from the audience. Adebayo, you're with CJID. I don't want you.
There's a lady at the back.
Okay, 2 questions. Ifeanyi, I'm so sorry. Just who is with the microphone? Please say your name and organization, and you have exactly 30 seconds to ask your question, straight to the point. And please mention the panelists that you want your question to go to. I think there was a hand at the back.
The lady.
Who is with the microphone? Oh. Please help him.
I do believe that we have left out an important fact. And she almost got to it. But do we believe that most of our leaders have the desire for change that the new generation people have? So it is those organizations like CJID all over Africa that will have to change the mindset of those who govern us. Our leaders seem to respond more to the symbolism of collaboration than to its reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that deserved a round of applause.
Thank you, sir.
Sorry, before we take the next 2 questions or one, we have Dr. Eze online. Is he here?
I'm just going to tell all my intervention around the questions that you shared with me, but also to complement some of the very wonderful points that the panelists have raised, especially even the last question. I think that reimagining democracy means going beyond periodic elections. And I think that the youths of this region are beginning to say that out even much louder. Sure. So it means nurturing institutions, just like Stanley said, that are stronger than individuals and ensuring that power remains accountable to the people. But more importantly, it means prioritizing people's power over that of statesmen, strengthening judicial independence, fortifying the institutions meant to protect democracy and ensuring that exercise of power after elections truly serves the citizens. It means recognizing civil society and media as agents of democratic consolidations. It means embracing digital tools to make governance open, transparent, and responsive. And I'm going to ask us some very fundamental questions, because democracy must be rooted in our own realities, in African values of dialogue, solidarity, and human dignity, not imposed from outside or reduced to procedural rituals that lack substance. I've often tried to understand what democratic backsliding in West Africa means in practice. Is it merely erosion of established ongoing challenges? For example, are citizens confronting systems that they perceive as imperial impositions and using whatever means available to exist? Or are they facing crisis of democracy itself, a legitimacy crisis stemming from civil rule that often masks authoritarian tendencies, like the moderator said? Perhaps we are relying on borrowed lexicons that fails to capture the region's political and contextual realities. So why are military coups predominantly re-emerging in Francophone countries? Is this a coincidence, or does it reveal unresolved histories of external influence, entrenched political economies, or distinctive patterns of state-society relations in this context? In whose name, indeed, and under whose mandate do political elites continue to hold power? Why are we so quick to dismiss the military as being outside of political system, when in fact, it is an institution shaped by the same social, economic, and political dynamics as the rest of the society?
True.
We cannot meaningfully discuss democracy while pretending that the military exists in isolation. So to what extent does our discourse artificially separate civilians from soldiers, rather than examining the broader governance ecosystem that produces both of them? Ultimately, are we truly only concerned about democracy in the procedural sense? I hope not. Or is it about democracy in a substantive sense and the quality of it as experienced by citizens? I certainly hope so. Perhaps the more urgent conversation is not only about protecting democratic forms, but also about rebuilding state legitimacy in a region where many people feel they have been abandoned by those who govern them. And if I have more time, I don't know how much time I have, Madam Moderator, I would like to, in this context, because you have also asked for some bold conversation around the ECOWAS protocol.
In 1 minute, please.
And I feel that to remain relevant, ECOWAS must redesign and realign its normative framework, especially the protocol on democracy and good governance, to be able to respond to today's realities and challenges. It must also strengthen peace building, not peacekeeping, especially when a country like Nigeria can no longer lead peacekeeping mission because of its own internal challenges and also the cost. So the challenge of terrorism that continue to creep into our polity and extension of presidential mandate undermines democratic process. It doesn't matter what anybody wants to justify that for. And this must be addressed head on. As we discuss at the 47th ECOWAS summit in Ghana, it was the leaders themselves that said this should be done. And after that was done, the authority have refused for that to be presented. I was still working in WANEP when we contributed to the redesign of this protocol. So ECOWAS must also strengthen its financial independence. It used to be the case in the past. So the institutional capacity, so that it can decisively and credibly in all times of crisis have what we call African solution to African problem. African solution to African problem with somebody else's resources, in my opinion, is a mirage. So to that extent, and in concluding, I believe that
Dr. Eze, if you could please conclude in the next minute.
So as ECOWAS is now 50, it must be people-centered, not just in May.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Dr. Eze, and I think that brings this panel discussion to a very fine end. I'm sorry we will not be able to take questions. For next year, please, we want 2 hours for this panel, and please, I want to moderate it again. So thank you so much. We'll just take a photograph, and then thank you so much for being a beautiful audience.
Thank you, thank you. Please, let's put our hands together for them.